Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, episode 91, The Sieges of the Duke of Wellington, with special guest Dr. Zack White. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all of our listeners that if they'd like to support our podcast, please go to patreon.com/Generals and Napoleon. As always, we appreciate your support. Now, on with the show.
I'm very well, mate. How are you doing?
Um,
Yes, as you say, it's been a while. We did talk actually about doing one a little while back, didn't we? Talking about British generals, people like Picton and all the
we
rest of it.
did,
But I
yeah.
gather,
We're going to talk about an interesting topic that I really wanted to get to for a while now, which is siege warfare. And you have a book coming up on this topic, do you not?
I do. It's not actually finished yet. It's called An Unavoidable Evil, which is a Clausewitz quote. We might sort of start talking about why he goes with that interpretation in a bit. But yeah, it's an entity collection looking at siege warfare across the Napoleonic era, not just those kind of classic Wellingtonian sieges, which ultimately we'll talk a lot about today, but also looking at things like sieges in Russia, in India, and just kind of asking all kinds of thematic questions about sieges and their operations and impact. There's even a piece in there by Beatrice de Graaf looking at the creation of the Wellington Barrier, as it was called, which was a series of fortifications along the French border created in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars to try and sort of defend that region against threats of future French invasions. So
Mm.
it's a really kind of big thematic study, and as I say, I haven't actually finished it yet, which is less than ideal. But my authors have been incredibly patient whilst I've dealt with some health problems, and the plan is that it will be out with Hellion hopefully later this year at some point.
Okay, yeah, it's through Hellion Books, and it's called An Unavoidable Evil, Siege Warfare in the Age of Napoleon. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is a group that I'm a member of, which is the NRWGC. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So NRWGC stands for the Napoleonic and Revolutionary War Graves Charity. Founding a charity is a bit like having a child in that it just doesn't stop and
Mm.
you love it dearly. But the premise behind it, I mean, we do what we say on the tin, quite frankly. So
Mm.
folks who listen might be familiar with organizations like the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. There's an American equivalent actually that looks at a much wider period. But effectively, the idea is that we honor veterans of more recent conflicts, First World War, Second World War, but we just ignore those from earlier conflicts.
Mm.
And my kind of interest in this was particularly piqued when Professor Ed Koss was telling me about the efforts that he was making to bury, study with a view to burying six guys who were discovered out in Burgos, one of the sieges we're going to talk about in this episode. These guys were found at the site of the main breach, and they have just been stuck in a cardboard box. And that just didn't sit well with me. These people are veterans who've given their life, perhaps not necessarily for the cause, but certainly in order to fulfill the requirements of their national government. And I think any death in the service of your country is a tragedy
Mm.
that should just be marked and honoured. So I went away and scratched my head and eventually thought, well, why don't we set up a charity that not only buries veterans, but also restores the graves of those who did make it back? Because, of course, the majority survive.
Mm.
And that was an incredibly naive move. But yeah, we're doing incredible work. We are an international team. We don't just focus on British soldiers, we cover every nationality of those who served from 1775 through to 1815. We restore the graves of veterans who made it back. We put markers on graves where people don't have a grave marker, either because it's just disappeared or it's been destroyed. A lot of
Mm.
headstones actually get pulled out in the latter half of the 19th and early 20th century because they're seen as kind of cluttering up the place, which I just
Mm.
think is a really kind of icky approach to take. So we, in some cases, put in small, respectful, modest monuments to say, look, buried here is person X, and this is what they did. But we also focus on burying veterans as well. So just before Christmas, I was out in Spain negotiating with the local authorities over the Burgos guys. Um, so as you can imagine, it keeps me pretty busy. It's an amazing cause. Hopefully, your listeners will kind of feel that it's right and proper that we do actually make the effort to go and find out where these guys are buried, to clean up their graves so that they look respectable,
Hmm.
and important to bury these disinterred veterans. And if they're interested, they can head to the charity's website, www.nrwgc.com.
Yeah, no, I think it's a noble cause. And if you'd like to learn more, the NRWGC also has a Twitter page. And as Zach mentioned, please go to the website. You can either donate or become a member like I am. It's pretty inexpensive. I think it's $25 or 25 pounds per year. So I
Yeah.
think it's an easy way to help out. Okay, we are going to dive in now to the meat and potatoes of our little chat, which is um, basically siege warfare and the Peninsula War. We'll do a few others that are outside the peninsula, but primarily we're going to focus on Wellington. But before we get to that, there's a great quote in the movie Patton where the famous general remarks, quote, "Fixed fortifications are monuments to the stupidity of man," end quote. Why was siege warfare so important during the Napoleonic Wars?
the the line from Patton makes a lot of sense when you kind of think about post 1939 styles of combat. It's a comment that Patton can make.
Right.
And at the risk of talking about the wrong war here, perhaps we should kind of expand on that. And I do refer to the First and the Second World War as the wrong war. It's one of my pet rants,
Mm.
not least because the Napoleonic Wars used to be known as the Great War until the War of 1914 to 1918 came along. But you've got a very different style of warfare that develops in the course of the Second World War. Initially, in the First World War, so to take it back to the other wrong war, um, there's this kind of idea of almost like a warfare by timetable. So the German plan, the Schlieffen Plan,
Hmm.
that they enact in 1914 is very much designed about how fast can you move troops on railways to X location, and a lot of the planning behind that is very much about almost, as I say, kind of like war by timetable. Then you get the trench system. That's in itself like an indication that Patton's comment doesn't really work, because a trench is in itself a piece of fixed fortification, and we're still using trenches to this day. The French solution to the fact that we got invaded by the Germans, then Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. We got invaded by the Germans in the First World War, 1914. We're a bit sick of being invaded by the Germans now, so they build this line of, in theory, impregnable fortifications along the French-German border in Alsace and Lorraine. And then mechanization happens, and
Mm.
blitzkrieg happens, and high explosive rounds happen, and rockets get developed. And so fortifications kind of go out of vogue, because you can stick as much concrete as you like around a structure, but if I've got a rocket with a high explosive head on it, I can make a nice big hole in your fortification, or I can even bring your fortification in around you. And whilst I'm doing that, I can also just send my tanks around the side, which is precisely ultimately what the Germans do. I mean, people have been fortifying things since we started developing like social cohesion and having things that we wanted protecting. So
Hmm.
market towns end up needing to be defended because you've got stuff that you want to protect there. You know, these places become kind of like tax hubs. Ports obviously need defending because you don't want somebody to come in and smash up all of your very expensive boats.
Right.
Technical term there. But you um with all of that, you end up with these weird mishmashes of fortress cities. But as you say, a lot of these fortresses get built because they dominate key routes into countries,
Hmm.
um, and that therefore means that if you want to invade, you don't want to be leaving a big garrison in your rear where they can sally out and wreak havoc. So you can't go past the fort without doing something about it, because logistics, your lines of communication matter. As to why these end up being so important during the Napoleonic Wars, there's actually a bit of debate there about whether they become less important because of the tactics that the French start to employ. It's a slightly faster style of warfare, that we see with that use of, sort of those semi-independent core that allows kind of entry along multiple routes, and so the focus ends up becoming on achieving an overwhelming victory against field armies. And to do that, you can't afford to get mired down and bogged down with sieges. And
Hmm.
that's all seen as a break from the 18th century way of war, where the focus was much more about siege warfare. You know, you take some ground and you hold it, and then you move on. Um, and you know, the you see this development of very sophisticated defenses that are designed to hold up armies for as long as humanly possible.
Well, let's discuss the Duke of Wellington sieges during the Peninsula War. And I thought this was brilliant. We're going to classify them in different, these multiple sieges as the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Oh
And
yeah.
before we get into the individual sieges and battles, let's discuss siege warfare overall. It seems to me that the process of a siege was pretty straightforward. You surround an enemy castle or fortress or city. You cut off all chances of resupply and reinforcement. You build siege lines or parallels that bring your guns closer and closer to the city. You punch a hole in the wall or holes in the wall. You offer the besieged a chance to surrender. If they refuse, you send the army in, and that's that. But there's more to it, correct?
Uh, I mean, look, the fundamentals of sieges haven't really changed in about 3,000 years
Hmm.
during this period. If you want to get into a place that is fortified, you've basically got three options. The first is to bottle the place up until the people inside run out of provisions and starve.
Hmm.
The second is knock a hole in the perimeter defenses and send people through it to kill the garrison. Or you could perhaps try and get some of the people inside to turncoat and let you in, or you could try and spread disease within those or set the place on fire so that they've got to give up. But that last one doesn't tend to happen very much. There are exceptions. Copenhagen, we basically firebomb the place. It's a very controversial thing. I know you're going to talk about that on another episode, so I won't say
Yeah,
any more on that. But you know, basically, you haven't got much in the way of options for all of this.
yeah,
Um, and as we've talked about and hinted towards, fortifications are very sophisticated by this point. They've got multiple layers to them. There's a guy called Vauban who does a lot of very impressive siege design in the 18th century. And the walls of these fortresses don't just jut out of the ground anymore. It's not like, here's a very big castle wall, there's a nice big target. I can smack a hole in that nice and easy. Thank you for making that nice and simple for me.
right.
People have developed the concept of a glacis, which is like a gentle slope, and it's angled in such a way to basically deflect the incoming cannon fire. What you then have is a development of people focusing on the high ground surrounding these fortifications so that you don't have to sit at the bottom of the glacis and go, well, I can't see the wall. What am I going to fire at?
Hmm.
And then, of course, people start defending the high ground around these fortifications. Um, and so you get sort of redoubts and other forms of sort of mini fortifications and outworks to try and defend against the likely points from which you would sight a battery of guns in
Hmm.
order to get over the glacis and fire directly down into the onto the wall itself. But essentially, you've got to knock a hole in this wall because if you just send your men to run at the walls, they're going to get to the edge of the glacis. They're then going to have to jump down and good kind of 12 feet, maybe 18 feet, maybe 24 feet into a ditch. Um, and then once they've done that, how are they going to get up the wall that is, let's say, 30 feet high? You know, you're going to need a
Right.
very long ladder. But if you're doing that under fire, that's risky, and a
Yeah.
lot of people are going to die. So, as you said, you know, you create these parallels to move your batteries forwards. Siege guns are generally much heavier in caliber than your standard artillery pieces. So the biggest that the British are packing during this period, when it comes to standard artillery, is a 9 pounder. The French have the 12 pounder, so they pack a bigger artillery piece. I'm sure people can make plenty of jokes about that. Um, when it comes to siege guns, though, you've generally you're talking about 18 pounders or maybe 24 pounders. Now, 24 pounders are the standard armament aboard HMS Victory. You've also got the howitzer option, which howitzers fire on a parabolic arc. The howitzers obviously are not ideal for use against a wall because trying to judge the drop
Hmm.
is quite a challenge. And there's a lot of digging involved, as you can imagine, with all of this. You've got to create these zigzag parallels, and the reason they're zigzagged is so that if a cannonball ends up landing within one, it doesn't just travel along the length of your parallel and annihilate everybody who's within it. The digging itself is inevitably just it's brawn, it's manual labour, so it's done by the regular troops, but they're overseen by engineers. And the trouble, of course, is that there aren't enough engineers ever,
Mm.
and lots of them die in the process of these sieges. A lot of the work is done at night in order to just minimize casualties where
Right.
possible. Because in order for your guns to end up close enough to effectively fire on a fortification, inevitably you have to be within effective artillery range of their defences.
Right.
You also get sharpshooters sometimes deployed to kind of keep the heads of gunners down. But think about the effective lethal range of even a rifle during this period. That's 300 yards. So you've got to ask some people to crawl very close to fortification. Now, they don't necessarily need to be within effective aimed range. So, if you've got a musket, you don't necessarily need to be within 80 yards of the wall,
Mm.
because the idea is just to make people duck
Hmm.
and less inclined to take pot shots. But it's deeply unpleasant work. You can also spring mines. They're used at Burgos, for example,
Hmm.
but they're not common, I would say, during this period. Mines are more often used as a means of defense, um, to kill an assault party once it manages to make its way through the breach.
Was the Duke of Wellington trained in siege warfare? It seems like he preferred to fight a battle out in the open versus a siege.
Almost all commanders during this period would have preferred that kind of open battle um, style where they can bring their own tactical ability to bear on the occasion. They don't have to worry about the morale element quite so often because the troops can kind of be actively involved. Also, it doesn't take so long to fight a battle, if you know what I mean. A siege, you've got that ongoing push, day by day, the attritional losses, that all saps the morale. If you're marching, you're doing something. If you're standing in the line and you're firing, you are doing something. And from a kind of psychological perspective, that's massive. Sure,
Yeah.
you might be withdrawing, and we know from soldiers' accounts that they hated having to withdraw without having the chance to fight. You can manage that morale much more effectively. Whereas if you're involved in siege operations, you know that the storm is coming
Right.
potentially. So that's kind of that lingering cloud on the horizon that's going to have a massive impact on how you're thinking about things. Mental health matters at all periods in history. And if people are being picked off day by day because they've got in the way of a cannonball whilst they've been digging fortifications, you feel that every
Yeah.
day. So yeah, nobody likes a siege. Not specifically, partly because there isn't much training for officers of the British Army during this period.
Hmm.
And we've got to bear in mind Wellington is the exception to that rule. When it comes to officers of the period, he binds his way up, but he is actually pretty good in a
Yeah.
system where you can buy your way up the ranks. And the focus isn't on professionalism, and so you get people who are utterly incompetent in
Yeah.
the rank of colonel. Sandhurst is only opened in like 1812.
Hmm.
Um, the people who are trained in siege warfare is, of course, the Corps of Engineers, but as I say, there aren't enough of them, and Wellington is constantly complaining about that. He'd have picked up the fundamentals when he studied Angers, and he would have also picked up the fundamentals just on the job. But theory's only going to get you so far. Part of the reason, actually, that Wellington isn't very good at sieges, and he's not, it's a real chink in his capabilities as a commander. But part of the reason for that is that a lot of his hands-on experience comes from India, and this isn't kind of a to talk down um, the situation out in India by any stretch. The fortifications are decent. You get some really tough ones, but they're just not on the same scale as what people like Vauban have been designing in Europe.
Hmm.
And some of these defenses that Wellington comes up against are like walls without a fire step. So when he storms Ahmednagar in India, he storms it by escalade, and it nearly goes wrong for the very simple reason that although it's a great idea because there's no ditch and it's really easy to just kind of put a ladder up against the wall, jump over. But when
Yeah.
they get to the wall, they find that there's the wall and there's nothing on the other side of it.
Mm.
There are no cannons, there's no fire step, there's no walkway. And so they're kind of having to shimmy their way along to a bit where there is actually something that they can stand on and walk on, and they take fire in the process. These fortifications just aren't quite as complex. They're decent.
Right.
Um, Galgir has a decent set of fortifications to it. Springer-Patan, the anniversary for that was just the day before we are recording this.
Hmm.
So there are some major sieges out in India, but they're just not as these fortifications just aren't as complex. You know, they're not the classic star fortress that where people might have seen these images on social media.
Right.
These very kind of symmetrical fortresses that have been built with lots of kind of well, I mean the clues in the word, like almost star-like patterns to them that are designed to just create overlapping fields of fire from every conceivable angle. That's not what you get
Yeah.
built in India, and because he hasn't had to deal with that kind of thing, I think it does mean that Wellington. Josh Provan uses the line really well, actually. Wellington kind of flicks into India mode sometimes and
Hmm.
thinks that some of these fortifications and these castles are going to be a little bit easier than they are, and they're just not. Doesn't matter which of these you look at. Look at the people should Google like Ciudad Rodrigo by air. The spelling will catch people out. So it's Ciudad Rodrigo,
Right.
and it's exactly this kind of thing because the fortifications are largely intact. It's a beautiful city.
Yeah.
Strongly recommend people go there.
We're going to get into the individual sieges now, and I'd like to start off with the second siege of Badajoz, or Badajoz, however you want to pronounce it, in 1811, which was a loss for Wellington. And what happened in this particular siege?
Yeah, second Badajoz is a mess, and it's the reason it's a mess is that it's born out of a situation that Wellington didn't really anticipate. He didn't see it coming. So it's May and June 1811 that this siege takes place, and just a couple of months before, Wellington's been pushing north from the lines of Torres Vedras, and didn't really expect Badajoz to fall, and in fact had been sending some troops off, kind of splintered them off from his army and sent them off to support and hopefully relieve Badajoz, but they just don't arrive anywhere near like in time to prevent this. So he ends up with a problem that both Ciudad Rodrigo, which is the northern of the two fortresses, and Badajoz, which guard the two main routes into the heart of Spain
Right.
and the roads that will ultimately lead on to Madrid, are both now in French hands, which means he hasn't got a route into the interior of the country. Now, that's a massive problem because, like we say, if you're going to move into the heart of Spain,
Right.
you don't want to leave these big, well defended locations with sizable garrisons behind you where they can just come out when they want to
Hmm.
and sit literally on the road over your lines of communication and just prevent you from getting supplies, reinforcements, and all the rest of it. So
Right.
he now has to take both. He knew that Ciudad Rodrigo had fallen because that falls in 1810. Almeida, which is the twin to Ciudad Rodrigo, just on the Portuguese side of the border, had also fallen.
Hmm.
And that's why we get the Battle of Fuente Doñuro, because Wellington blockades the, the fortress of Almeida. And the reason he does that is that he doesn't have decent siege artillery. He
Hmm.
just doesn't have the tools, those 18-pounders that he needs, in order to smash a hole in the defences and storm the place. So he's got to blockade it. Whilst he's doing that in the north, he's also trying to keep Badajoz occupied. Again, probably just thinking it's going to be a little bit easier than it really could ever have been. Um, and he's kind of trying to do too much at once, and I think that's the problem here. So the siege starts on the 22nd of April, 1811, and they don't have any siege guns.
Hmm.
So you've got a siege that starts, and these guys don't have a way of fighting their way into the town. The siege guns aren't even available until the 5th of May.
Right.
Um, and some of those pieces are really old, almost like antiques. The historian Charles Oman describes the place where they're sourced, which is the Portuguese fortress of Elvas, um, as being almost like a museum of old antique artillery pieces during this time. Um, And ultimately, Beresford has to give up the first siege because Soult approaches to relieve it. That's why you get the Battle of Albuera on the
Yeah.
16th of May. Badhoff is a very sophisticated fortress. You can actually see some of the defences to this day.
Mm.
The city has expanded outwards and they've knocked down chunks of the wall, but you can go and stand at the foot of these walls. And we're not
Mm.
just talking like a nice, neat, thank you very much. You just kind of taken that chunk of wall out and dumped it in a neat pile to the side so I can just walk through casually. And so I've got to scramble up this rocky slope full of loose rocks whilst under fire the whole way.
Mm-hmm.
People on the surrounding walls shooting at me, the people at the top throwing things, big lumps of masonry down as I'm scrambling up.
Mm-hmm.
At the top, they'll have stuck a barricade there. There'll be people on the other side of that barricade trying to bayonet me as
Right.
I try and get over this barricade. You can see why these sieges result in catastrophic losses. I think it's about 4,000 people die at the final siege of Badajoz.
Mm-hmm.
They're horrendous
Yeah.
affairs. But interestingly, so Albuera's fought, and ultimately Saul decides to retire. Um, and so they restart the siege. This is why it continues on into June.
Mm-hmm.
And the trouble is that there isn't really a weak spot to this place.
Right.
The high ground is well defended by a series of outer fortifications. The governor is really, really committed. There's a guy called Philippon, very intelligent guy. I believe was an engineer actually
Mm-hmm.
in training, but he nearly runs out of supplies. The men are down to half rations, and he's at the point where he's planning some kind of desperate breakout.
Mm-hmm.
The Allies have made limited headway. They managed to breach the castle, but not the fort that occupies the high ground to the north of Badajoz. But in the process of trying to do all of that, Marmont basically takes his army. He's taken over command of the French army of Portugal
Mm-hmm.
from Messina in the wake of the Battle of Fuente d'Onoro. He collects his army together and marches south to reinforce Soul. So they've then got a massive advantage in numbers, and Wellington just decides to back off. And so ultimately, the French forces saved from having to do that desperate breakout. They've learnt the lesson this time because they realised that they didn't have enough supplies.
Right.
Philippon, being a very intelligent, forward thinker, thinks, right, well, we're not going to have that problem again.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no way that they could have done anything other than hammer their way into Badajoz when they then have to go back for the third siege.
So I'm going to qualify this one as a bad one. We're going to get to ugly and good here in a minute. Is that okay? We're going to the Badajoz.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Okay.
Yeah, this is bad. It's not ugly. It's just badly handled.
Okay. All right. So now on to my next example, and I'll let you decide if this is good, bad, or ugly. In 1811, during the blockade of Almeida, where Wellington's forces win a huge battle at nearby Fuentes de Onoro, the French defenders of Almeida, slip out of the town under the nose of Wellington's subordinates. The Duke famously states, "We had 13,000 to watch over 1,400 of them. I have never been so distressed by any military event as the escape of even a man of them," end quote. Was this a pretty rare occurrence when a defending army could slip through enemy siege lines and escape?
So this is actually second Almeida. First Almeida is when the French are invading Portugal for the third time under
Right.
Messina. And that's basically a lucky shot ignites
Yeah.
a trail of powder
Yep.
that runs all the way back to the Allied magazine, and the entire magazine in the castle blows up. This is the one problem with Almeida. It doesn't have deep magazines. Everything's just kind of stocked in the basements of the castle.
Mm-hmm.
And literally, it's one of the opening shots of the siege, just sends up the entirety of the powder supply,
Right.
flattens the castle. And so this siege that should have, Almeida should have held up the French for a good couple of months, potentially even delayed Massena's advance long enough that he couldn't have continued the campaign until 1811.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, it's over with a matter of days. So that's first Almeida. Second Almeida inevitably the French have garrisoned the place
Right.
after they surrender, because without any supply, the Allies have to just give up the place. Um, and as a result of that, without Wellington having siege guns, his only option is to blockade it. Now,
Hmm.
that's why we have Fuente d'Onoro. Wellington nearly gets his backside handed to him by Massena. I would say this is the closest Wellington comes from being properly broken
Hmm.
in open combat. The net result is that Wellington does just about manage to hold the line, and so Massena has to give up. Um, and you were asking, is this a rare occurrence? The odd person getting through carrying a message isn't that unusual. And Messina ends up being a classic example of that at Fuente d'Onoro. He sends three messengers rather, to um, Almeida in the aftermath of Fuente, saying, "Look, I can't get through.
Hmm.
You're on your own. Do as best you can. Make a decision."
Right.
Now, two of those messengers actually get shot as spies. They're captured. So it should be quite hard to break the cordon, but one does manage to get through. And
Mm.
this is why we have the evacuation by Brenier, who's the governor of Almeida during this time. And the trouble is that the cordon isn't tight enough that the Allies have placed. It's just too lax. They haven't posted piquets near enough to the fortifications to give them that warning when the French do make a break for it. That therefore means that when the French do decide to make a run for it, they're just able to smash their way through, and then they just run
Right.
for the bridge. And I think the bigger issue in Wellington's eyes actually is that they're not held at the bridge.
Right.
They're not kind of cut off. In fact, the one of the colonels of one of the regiments, Colonel Bevan, commits suicide over the incident
Ugh.
because he's concerned about his reputation. And there's a lot of debate there about, was Wellington kind of responsible for that? Could he have been more supportive? A lot of that will depend on who you read. I'm not sure I'd quite call it ugly, because ultimately the British do achieve their objective, which is to get their hands on Almeida. The flip side, of course, is that the French blow up a number of the fortifications, so it's not much use to them once they've got it.
Yeah.
So it's not quite ugly, but I'm reluctant to create a fourth category.
Moving on. In 1812, he is successful at the siege of Ciudad Rodrigo. Why do you think this one went better for him?
This is all about planning and timing and logistics. You can see from what we've discussed already, Wellington breaks off the siege of Badajoz in June of 1811, and he doesn't really go massively on the offensive after that. Why? Because he's planning. He's looked at what's happened at Badajoz, realizes that he can't repeat what he did at Almeida for Ciudad Rodrigo, so he's got to pause and think and decide what he's going to do about all of this. And part of that is, I need a siege train. So he moves up this vast, dedicated, brand new, shiny, lovely, glistening siege train. He needs the guns to get inside. So, inevitably that takes time in terms of bringing it all together. You've also got to have, all of the supply. You've got to carry the ammunition. You've got to carry the tools for making more cannonballs should you need them. So then you've got to feed all of the animals that are going to drag these guns, which
Mm.
are incredibly heavy,
Hmm.
across the plains to Ciudad Rodrigo.
Hmm.
So that therefore means that you then need carts for the feed for those animals, but then you need to feed the animals that are drawing the carts, bringing the feed for the animals. So these things stretch for bloody miles. So there's a lot of planning that goes into it. And then Wellington strikes like a viper. He does this sometimes. He does it again at Salamanca. And his plan is to basically take this place before the French even know what's happening, because he knows as soon as he strikes and invests the city, which is the term that they use for encircling it and starting siege operations, the runners and riders are going to be going back to Marmont, whose headquarters in Salamanca, which is only a few days away, saying, "Help!" Now, Marmont actually has a problem, which is that his siege train is inside Ciudad Rodrigo when it's
Ah,
besieged. And so this is part of the reason that he can't retake the place, because he
right.
hasn't got his guns and he can't
Right.
just fabricate them from the ether. So that definitely helps Wellington in the aftermath, but it is such a quick operation. So the Light Division encircle the place on the 8th of January, and it's 10 days. The French have barely worked out what's happening before the British are storming the walls. So they knock two breaches, the greater breach and the lesser breach, into the fortifications. If you go to the site of one of two pieces of high ground that overlook Theodore Rodrigo from the north, there's the greater Tesson and the lesser Tesson. The lesser Tesson is now just it's a like a residential area. It's got blocks of flats all over it. If you
Mm-hmm.
go to the greater Tesson, you can actually, if you go at the right time of year, you can see the fading of the land where the old siege parallels were dug. You can't actually go and some folks might think, oh well, hang on, I can look at this on Google Maps and I can see this big ditch in
Mm.
one of the fields. That's not actually siege fortifications. That's defenses. So after this siege, the Spanish realised that on multiple occasions, when people have got into Theodore Rodrigo, the way they've done it is that they come down from the north, and so they build what they call the San Francisco Redoubt up on this piece of high ground, and you can still see the ditch.
Would we qualify this as a good Wellington siege?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
It's bloody,
Mm-hmm.
inevitably. They always are. But they construct a series of batteries, and as I say, you can go and you can see that you're standing in the right place because you can see like the zigzags of these parallels, and then the points where they break out into batteries. And yeah, it's taken in one night. Um, it's a multi-pronged attack. You
Mm-hmm.
could talk about, who's where and on all the rest of it, but I think you'd really need a dedicated episode just on that. There's a garrison of 1,800 men inside, and it's taken incredibly quickly. In the aftermath, though, you do get a precursor to what will happen in the aftermath of taking Badajoz. Spoiler
Mm.
alert, people.
Yeah.
In that the Allies spend the night sacking the place, and Wellington doesn't do much about it. And I think that's perhaps part of the reason why we get plunder on such a horrendous scale at Badajoz,
Yeah.
because they the troops kind of feel that they've got away with it at Theodore Rodrigo. There is
Yeah.
this expectation that once they get inside a place, they have the right to plunder.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about, this is a tradition of war. Wellington himself kind of references some of these traditions around siege warfare because part of the reason these operations are all just so horrendous in terms of losses is that there's a rule in war during this period where if you knock a hole in the defences,
Right.
you then surrender. Now, Napoleon goes and throws the cat amongst those pigeons by ordering all of his governors of fortifications that if they surrender before they've stood at least one assault, they will be court martialed and potentially shot.
Mm.
So Napoleon ends up changing the game and forcing all of these commanders to stand and take at least one attack.
When there's a breach, they say, "Hey, governor of the fortress, here's your chance. We'll spare you the sword, but if you don't, we're coming in." And they usually
We're
can
coming
sit.
in.
Yeah, yes or no.
And there is a very old rule in war that if you refuse that offer, where you can walk out with the honors of war, then if we if you're going to make me send men through this breach
Mm.
and risk their lives, then you are going to take the consequences, and those
Yeah.
consequences are that your lives are forfeit.
Yeah.
So Wellington himself says that he was in his rights to massacre the garrisons of Theodore Rodrigo and Badajoz
Yeah.
because of the rules of war. Now, in reality, had he done so, I think that would have been highly controversial.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of respect actually between British and French troops. So I think it would have caused all kinds of problems in
Yeah.
terms of treatment of prisoners of war and all the rest of it. So it was
And
the right call not to massacre them, but he
okay.
was within his rights to do so.
Okay. We'll come back to that in just a second. Unfortunately, during the siege, Wellington loses one of his key subordinates, Black Bob Crawford, in the attack on the breach. Were generals usually leading from the front during a siege, or were they kind of in the background?
In fairness to a lot of these commanders during this period, they're similar in that style because there's this sort of expectation that commanders generally will lead from more or less the front. It's
Mm-hmm.
not that unusual. So the men themselves talk about the distinction between come on and go on officers, i.e., those who are going to be 3 paces in front saying, come on, boys, we've got a job to do. Let's go take this position.
Right.
Versus those who will stand 3 paces behind the front lines and go on, boys, there's a good chap. You go and take that. I'll just sit here and have a nice cup of tea, kind of thing. But Wellington, Murat, Ney, the people we all admire, they're all people who stick themselves in the thick of the action.
Mm.
They're not shy about risking their own lives.
Yeah.
And you've got a lot of very senior figures who fall in sieges. Lieutenant Colonel Fletcher of the Royal Engineers is killed at San Sebastian.
Yep.
James Leith, who's commander of the 5th Division, which is the force that's besieging San Sebastian, is wounded in the same attack. Picton is wounded at Badajoz. Controversial though he was in his time and remains to this day, Picton was a man who had a serious pair of bollocks on him when it came to being in the right place at the right time to do his job as a commander. That doesn't change the fact that he was also an apocalyptically awful human being.
Right.
But, you can't deny the fact that the guy was brave.
Yeah.
And Theodore Rodrigo is no different to that. Picton himself, in the immediate aftermath, is in the town bellowing at the looters, telling them in expletive-laden terms to stop what the hell they're doing. And at one point he comes across the 88th, who had insulted a few months before, and the 88th never forgave Picton when he turned around and insulted them by describing them as the Connaught footpads for their looting. But somebody very cheekily shouts to him, "Are we still the Connaught footpads today, sir? Because we've just stormed this town." He goes, "No, my boys." And then he says something to the effect of, "We've taken the town, hurrah." So, these guys are very much in the thick of it.
Right.
And Crawford, when he dies, he's not leading the guys over the wall. That's not his job. But he is near the foot of the breach and, directing
traffic.
Exactly. We need more troops here, or actually we need to push along that wall, sending those messages, doing that kind of local tactical command stuff.
Yeah.
That is part of his job. Had he been back in sort of the first or the second parallel, that's no use.
Yeah.
And it's not really Crawford's style either. He was somebody who would lead from near the front or from the front himself. Think about what he does at Basarco.
Right.
He's, by that windmill, waiting for the opportune moment to then turn around to the 88th behind him and say, "Avenge John Moore," and send them forwards. So these guys it wouldn't have been in their mindset to not be near the front line, and that inevitably comes with its associated risks.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, moving along in our story here, Wellington follows up with another successful siege of Badajoz, again in 1812. But I think this siege should be classified in the ugly category based on the aftermath.
Yeah, I mean, Badajoz is so ugly that it almost kind of, I don't know what the equivalent of God tier is for ugly, but it's like God tier ugly. If you want to think about sieges like computer games, then Badajoz is the boss at the end of the game. It's that kind of level of just sheer impossibility. There are many things that work against the Allies in this one. Philippon, for a start, is just a really good commander, organizes a series of sorties against the parties that are digging these parallels and inflicts substantial losses that have an impact on morale. The weather is not good. It pours it down with rain, which means that the guys are basically shoveling mud over the course of this siege. And it takes them a long time. So they start the siege on the 16th and 17th of March. Inside is a French garrison of about 5,000 men. They've got food for 6 to 7 weeks. So Philippon's learnt the lesson from last time around. And it takes them a long time to storm the outer kind of redoubts that are there to protect against approaches, and then keep digging forwards, knock the breaches. The Allies fail to storm the breaches, and it's only the diversionary attacks, so 5th Division going in on the west side, and then Picton with his division successfully commanding the escalade despite being wounded, that enables these troops to stream across the length of the city and then attack the breaches from behind. And then the French give up defending the breaches, pull back, and then the floodgates open, and those who survived end up just pouring in. And we're talking about 3,500 men dying in those breaches.
Mm.
1,000 died in the siege before that. But the other trouble is that they've been planning a crime spree before the attack even starts. There are rumors going around that once they get inside, the place will be given over to them to plunder for a couple of hours. And they've been to Badajoz before, some of these guys. So when it was in Spanish hands,
Hmm.
prior to, in the wake of the Battle of Talavera, Wellington pulls his army back to this region. Some of these guys spend time within Badajoz, so they know where all of the wealthy houses are, where the silversmiths are.
Right.
And so they're having conversations about, look, you bring some candle, and what we'll do is we'll smash the locks on this place, and
Right.
then we'll go through that. So they have this idea before they've even started that they're going to go mental. But
They know where the
these
good wine cellars are. Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, and that's part of the problem as well. They find wine very rapidly. Having said all of that, though, the scale of the murder that happens, and murder does happen. Do not get me wrong, but the scale of the murder has been massively exaggerated. For a long time, people were banding around a figure of 4,000 Spanish civilians slaughtered. In reality, we know that there weren't 4,000 Spaniards inside Badajoz, period,
Hmm.
before the siege took place. And actually, some of these guys get let out before the siege even starts. What we've since found is some really detailed research in the Diocesan archives, which has revealed that actually it's about 200, 150 to 200 individuals who were either killed or severely wounded
Right.
as a result of all of this, which is still awful. Don't get me wrong, it is horrendous.
Yeah.
Another problem is that Wellington is very slow to react. He doesn't
Mm.
realize quite how bad this has got and hasn't put countermeasures in place beforehand to stop this from happening. He's just not, it completely blindsides him. He's absolutely apoplectic with fury,
Right.
but that rage just goes up a tier. So it's about 48 hours before Wellington is able to just regain control of his army. And yet, nobody is punished for it. But you
Right.
also get individuals who are quite brave in the course of this, sometimes because they have ulterior motives on their minds. So, this is famously the moment when Harry Smith and Lady Joanna, who becomes Joanna Smith, meet for the first time. He and his buddy, they're both rifle officers, John Kincaid, um, basically give Joanna and her sister protection over the course of this. And over the course of the evening, both Harry and John are flirting with Joanna, and it's Harry who's more successful. And very shortly afterwards, Harry and Joanna marry.
Mm.
She becomes, in time, Lady Smith.
Mm.
Um, so you do get some officers who are doing their best, but the
Right.
trouble with any siege assault is that the troops mingle because once you're in a breach, you don't know whether to go left or go right, and so platoons very quickly kind of get run straight into each other and get kind of mixed up, and
Right.
so the officers at one moment will think that they've got a platoon of the 27th in front of them, and then 5 minutes later, they find that they've got this mishmash of people from three different regiments who they don't know the names of.
Hmm.
And then once you're within the town, these are very narrow streets that these guys are disappearing into, so they can just duck left, duck right, and disappear.
Right.
And there's nothing these officers can do
Yeah.
to keep them under control. It's a perfect storm.
Okay. We'll come back to that because I do want to talk about the effects on the town civilians when we get to San Sebastian. But we have one more before that. We have in 1812, Wellington actually suffers a defeat at the siege of Burgos. And where you're talking earlier that I think it was Ciudad Rodrigo went well because of supply line and logistics, this one had a complete lack of that. And during the retreat from Burgos, he actually loses several hundred troops to capture. So I'm going to put this one. Do you want this in the bad or the ugly category?
Can I have both? Can I be greedy? Because it's a badly organized siege that then goes to hell over the course of the retreat.
Mm.
This is also one of the worst points for desertion in the British Army at any point over the campaigns. I think it's the second highest point in terms of numbers of people who desert.
Mm.
Um, the highest actually being once the war is over, but that's another story. Um, And yeah, there's just no preparation for this. As I say, that Josh Provenline captures this perfectly. Wellington flicking into India mode. He's very confident he's going to get in very easily, and he's not expecting it to be half as well defended as it is. So it's defended by about 2,000 Frenchmen
Hmm.
under General Du Breton. Um, and Wellington had three 18-pounders, five 24-pound howitzers, and just five engineer officers with him for this place. And they're totally overpowered by the artillery of the town itself.
Hmm.
Um, and the trouble with Burgos is that it's like a layered cake in terms of its different rings of defenses. So you can fight your way into the first tier and think, great. And then you look in front of you and see that there's this other whole tier of fortification above you. And once you stand at the site of these breaches and look at what they would have been greeted with once they fought their way inside, it's no wonder that they couldn't get in,
Hmm.
genuinely.
Hmm.
Um, and the French have been using this place as a field hospital, so it's already kind of a well defended, well stocked um, place where they've thought about approaches, particularly from the north. So they've built this hornwork. It's not actually quite finished, so the back end is kind of covered off by a palisade. Um, but they've thought through all of this, and as we've discussed, Wellington doesn't have the guns to batter his way in. So they try a mine, which then fails because as they tunnel, what they do is they find an old bit of a tower that had been knocked down a long time ago and think, oh great, we found the outer wall of Burgos.
Hmm.
But of course it's not. So they blow the mine, send forward the troops, only to find, oh, the wall's still intact. That wasn't. So then they have to spring a second mine,
Uh,
and you can still see the breach that it creates. You can physically stand in it. It's a huge thing. The amount of gunpowder that must have been packed into it, incredibly impressive.
hmm.
They eventually take the outer wall, so they invest the castle on the 19th. It's not until the 4th of October that they get to the outer wall. But then, like I say, there's another tier they've got to fight their way up to, and they just can't manage it. Repeated assaults are attempted. There are a series of sorties by the French, and by the 21st of October, Wellington looks at the wider strategic situation, sees that by this point it's Clausel who's in command of the French army of Portugal. He's collected up the army of Portugal from its defeat from Salamanca. He's
Right.
pushing south. Meanwhile, in the south of Spain, French forces, I believe they're under Soule,
Yeah,
have
there.
packed up and marched north and are threatening Madrid. So Wellington's about to get cut off, basically, get stuck in this pincer movement. So he has to kind of drop everything and run.
Hmm.
But the Allies have lost 24 officers and 485 men killed, and then
Yeah.
68 officers and 1,400 wounded. So bear in mind, they start this campaign season in 1812 in January.
Hmm.
They don't stop marching until November.
Hmm.
So they're on campaign 10 months, marching day by day. And the distances they travel. It's ridiculous. It's insane
Yeah.
to think how much they went through just in the course of that campaign. And so, yeah, their morale would have been shot. But one of the things they would have really resented is that they have to give up Burgos and march to Madrid. But then when they get to Madrid, they march all the way from Madrid to the Spanish Portuguese border
Right.
without a fight. There are points where Wellington stops and offers battle, but the French don't really want to take that
The bit.
gamble
Yeah.
because they're still reeling psychologically from Salamanca, where they thought they had him on the run,
Hmm.
and actually turned around and kicked them in the nuts. So they just will not fight him, even when they've got advantages of like 2 to 1.
Yeah.
And so the troops themselves are kind of going, why won't Wellington let us stand and fight? We'll
Yeah.
beat them because we're British and we're therefore just better.
Right.
Because that's their mentality. They've got this kind of sense that it doesn't matter where they fight. I mean, these guys are veterans by this point. They've done multiple campaigns
Yeah.
and they're getting accustomed to success. They're
Yeah.
used to this idea. Wellington's in charge. he picks good ground. We're hardy. We've beaten the French before. We can do it again. But they've only got this kind of very almost blinkered perspective of, I can see a battalion in front of me. We can take those guys, kind of
Right.
thing. They're not seeing that much bigger strategic picture,
Right.
which inevitably Wellington does have the grasp of.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is bad and it is ugly, but it's probably more bad than ugly.
Okay. Well, moving on to 1813, one that starts off good, but then ugly rears its ugly head. The British and the Allies are back on the offensive. They win the siege of San Sebastian, but the sacking and looting happen again. And this is the fascinating part. I did want to ask you about this the whole episode. The French troops and defenders aren't the ones who take the brunt of the pillaging, but it's the town civilians, the citizens, the Spaniards who are supposed to be their allies that are getting attacked and looted. Why do you think that is?
The simple reason is they sod off.
Mm,
In all of these cases, the garrison troops find a place to hole up. There's usually a citadel within these places, like a place of where you're going to make your final stand, a last resort.
mm,
Um, and that's where all of these governors go to. So in the case of Philippon at Badajoz, he actually goes to Fort San Cristobal, which is over the river, and just holes up there for the night and then surrenders the next day.
right,
San Sebastian, the citadel, is actually up on a massive, great hill, almost like a mountain. And it takes days, in fact, for the Allies to breach the citadel, and they have to take guns over to an adjacent island and fire across the sea because San Sebastian is basically it's a coastal um, town. And what that means is, well, the French have naffed off, so there's nobody else left but the civilians.
right.
The thing with San Sebastian is that it has been massively overplayed, a bit like the Badajoz thing. Some very unpleasant things happen,
Mm-hmm,
but the scale of what happened has actually been grossly exaggerated.
mm,
And there is this local myth that effectively the British walk in, they massacre everybody, and they deliberately burn this place to the ground, supposedly because the British are concerned that it's going to be a rival to some of the ports on the south coast, which is absolute nonsense. When you look at the size of San Sebastian, the only reason you would think that San Sebastian would be a rival to any of the British ports on the south coast is because you've never been outside of San Sebastian.
mm,
Like it's just not even close. The fortifications are largely gone now. Um, so the way I refer to San Sebastian these days is that it's sort of Paris by the sea. It's going
mm,
for that kind of vibe. They've re-landscaped almost everything. The river that was so key because it meant that you had to make the assaults at low tide because where the sea comes in, it raises the water level and you can't get men across, which therefore meant that a lot of these assaults had to happen at daylight, which therefore meant that their losses were much worse because the French could see exactly who to fire on and where. But yeah, the town's already burning when the British fight their way inside, to the point where at one point the attack is called off and delayed because the fire is too close to the breaches. So even if the troops had taken the breaches, they'd never been able to move beyond them.
mm,
So clearly, the British didn't burn the place down. There's a full scale inquiry off the back of it once these allegations hit the press.
mm,
And that actually gives us a much better indication of what the Allies were trying to do to quell the looting. And what's very apparent is that Wellington basically brings in all of the measures that he'd had to resort to in desperation at Badajoz, but he basically writes those into his orders about the assault so that they're there before the attack even takes place. In other words, he's preempting what's going to happen this time,
mm.
and he's got those measures built into his plan of attack.
Okay.
And don't get me wrong, looting does take place. There's a provost, or a series of provosts, in fact, sent into the town, and they flog anybody who they capture looting,
Mm-hmm,
and they, by their own admission, flog for the bulk of a couple of days, like pretty constantly. So
mm,
clearly, a lot of looting happens. There are claims that the local Spaniards also get involved in the looting, which might have made the situation worse. Now, whether or not that is actually true is open to debate and quite which sources you're prepared to trust.
Right.
It's quite often kind of held out as a defense. Oh, no, it wasn't the British, it was the Spaniards who looted themselves, kind of.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's probably a bit of both going on.
Okay.
So, yeah, it is ugly, but it's nowhere near as ugly as is claimed.
Got it. Well, Napoleon abdicates in 1814, and I did want to touch on some non-Wellington sieges that are interesting or perhaps unique. I know the French invested 2.5 years in a siege around Cadiz that ultimately failed. And I think this one, usually when Napoleon and his troops invested in a town, that town was going to fall, except for, I think, Acre and Cadiz. Why do you think this one stood out?
Uh, Partly it's geography, isn't it? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, all sieges are interesting, aren't they? So whether it's
Yeah.
Seringapatam, there's a siege of Ishmael, which features in the book, which is a Russian siege. That's an absolute bloodbath, even worse than Badajoz.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got lots of smaller operations that don't get the same level of attention. I mean, you could make an argument even that the lines of Torres Vedras is an attempt at a siege. But yeah, Cadiz, inevitably, you can keep it resupplied by sea. It means that you can't cut the place off. You've only got one line of attack. It is well defended, and the French just aren't able to push an advantage when it comes to Cadiz.
Yeah.
Um, they do manage to take some of the fortifications on one side of the bay, but having done that, that doesn't give them a huge advantage in terms of trying to knock a breach because it's on the other side of a bay. You can't send troops into a breach on that side.
Right.
You've also got a very substantial Spanish and British force that is there as an additional form of defense, but they're not cooped up inside the walls of Cadiz itself.
Mm-hmm.
They're actually on one of the headlands nearby. And that's how you get the Battle of Barossa, where this force tries to outflank the French besieging forces, hit them in their rear, but then ultimately doesn't do it. The Spanish general who's in overall command is claimed to have bottled it, basically, and basically sort of cuts and runs for safety of Cadiz itself.
Right.
And then it's the British who basically have to fight off this advancing French force that's pulled back and then tries to pounce on them,
Yeah.
whilst the Spanish basically sit back and watch and do nothing,
Yeah.
and let the British literally fight their battle for them.
Yeah.
So yeah, Cadiz is an interesting one, but it's not that dissimilar a situation to Gibraltar.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, Gibraltar gets besieged multiple times in the 18th century and doesn't fall. Why? Because it can be resupplied by sea.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's kind of talk on that. Because I want to talk about what factors lead to a successful siege versus an unsuccessful siege, and what do you think was imperative to making a good siege versus a failed siege?
I think it comes down to ultimately maybe four things. Logistics is the first one.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have a decent siege train, you're not getting inside. If you don't have the means of supplying your troops, you're not getting inside because your army is going to disintegrate. Equally, if you haven't, or if you have rather paid as a defender of a fortress, if you've paid attention to logistics and if you're thinking about putting men on three-quarter rations or whatever it might be, that helps in terms of prolonging the siege long enough to allow friendly forces to arrive to relieve that pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Morale is, we've talked about this a lot, it's obviously key.
Mm-hmm.
If your men can be hyped up enough to either hold the line or to break through, that, once you're inside, it's usually a done deal. Not always. We didn't have the time to talk about Bergen op Zoom
Right.
on this one, but that's kind of an exception to the rule.
Right.
So morale is clearly key. You've got to ask a huge amount of your men in order to ask them to run through these gaps in walls. And if they haven't got that, then you're not getting inside, as simple as that. And plenty of assaults will fail
Mm-hmm.
because the morale just falters, the men aren't making headway, and they just can't keep running into fire. But timing also matters. We see this with Theodore Rodrigo, don't we? We see
Right.
this with Napoleon's Italian campaign. Holding up armies long enough to stop support from arriving, so that you got the time that you need. Sometimes that's just blind luck. Um, a commander being away at the opportune moment can lead to enough of a delay to prevent a relief column from arriving and forcing a besieging force to give it up and allow the garrison to be resupplied.
Yeah.
But ultimately bravery as well. Nobody during this period who stands and fights one of these sieges can really be regarded as a coward. The
Right.
scale of what they're asked to do is just horrific. Quite often, as with battles, what is key here is those individual acts of courage,
Mm.
those moments where people take the initiative, pick up that flag, and charge on, trusting their comrades to go with them. And I think that's perhaps why we enjoy reading about sieges quite so much, because it's those acts of courage that really come to the fore in the most extreme of circumstances. And I don't think there's anything more extreme in warfare than having to assault a breach in a fortress. It's very much about initiative being taken by people, having the right individuals at the right place at the right time. And you can cater for that as a commander. You can make sure that you have the right men in command, but also it's about the individuals seeing the opportunity, leading a diversionary attack and going, actually, no, we need to convert this into a main attack because not only are we making progress, but actually the noises on the other side of this city suggest that things are going badly for our guys elsewhere, and we
Right.
need to do what we can to make this attack count.
Right. Well, that was very informative and very eye-opening. Thank you so much, Zach. That was an incredible episode. I can't believe we covered as much as we did right there. The book, again, one more time, it is going to be out eventually, correct? So
Yeah, that's right. Not sure when, but it'll be out at some point, folks.
It's An Unavoidable Evil, Siege Warfare in the Age of Napoleon. And Zack White, yeah, thank you again, my friend. That was stupendous, wonderful, informative, brilliant. I've run out of superlatives, but thank you for that. That was really good.
My pleasure.
Yeah. And again, if you find Zach, you can find him on Twitter. I also recommend the NRWGC charity. Please look that up. And we thank you for your time, sir.